Okay, we're here doing the second shir on the Halachos of Berachos, and once again, it's hard to paskin from this. However, it'll give you a grounding and a yediyah, knowing all the different areas of halacha very quickly, very good for review. Okay, let's continue with the first bracha rishona. So first of all, you have to have benefit when you're eating. So it has to taste good, it has to be nutritional, one of the two. Water, right? Water doesn't really have a nutritional benefit. It has a health benefit, but it doesn't have a nutritional benefit, and it doesn't actually taste good, right? It doesn't really have a taste. And therefore, if a person's drinking it to quench thirst, right, if it tastes good, so then a person for sure makes a bracha. And if it's for digestion, whatever that means, you're gonna have to ask a rabbi. One, we're not talking about dehydration necessarily. Usually, that will quench thirst, but for sure, when a person's clearing their throat or swallowing a pill or for a bowel movement, meaning it's just a necessity, you're not really drinking it for the enjoyment, you don't make a bracha. And once again, you might need a rabbi to help you decide. Harmful foods, so a diabetic eating sugar, yes, he would make a bracha, but if it's poison or acute danger, serious danger, no, they would not make a bracha. Person's being forced to eat, it's a suffix, it's a doubt, and therefore, when we come to rabbinic bracha beforehand, you don't make a bracha when you're being forced to eat, someone's physically forcing you to eat. However, when it comes to bread, you would make birkas hamazon, right? Because that's a doubt about a biblical requirement, and therefore, the right, so you have to be stringent and make the bracha anyway. Okay, a person eats in an unnatural manner. So in terms of introgastric feeding would be an example of this. It's a suffix, so you try and hear the bracha, you say amen. A repugnant food, right? That's something disgusting, like olive oil, it burns. If you drink real olive oil, it burns your throat. Same thing like raw ginger, right? Raw peppercorns, cocoa powder, right? These things are really not edible, and therefore a person would not make a bracha. Unripe fruit that's inedible, right? You can't really eat it. You don't make a bracha. When does it cross that line? You might need a rabbi's opinion, because let's say raw eggs, right? Those are somewhat disgusting, and yet you would make a bracha. That's understood that you would. When the food is repugnant because of gluttony, like a person's going to throw up, they have no desire to eat the food, a person would not make such a bracha. Now, let's say it's distasteful and you're only eating it for health reasons. You'd never eat this food, right? It tastes like grass or something like that. A person doesn't make a bracha on such a thing. Once again, it really needs a shaila just to make sure. But let's say it's medicine, so even flavored medicine like cherry, right? They're trying to make it taste good, but you would never have it if it not that you needed it for cough syrup or something. So it's a suffix, it's very complicated. So make a bracha on something else, that would be the best. But you don't make a bracha because it's a suffix. Now let's say tasting. Tasting, you really don't make a bracha, but it's a disagreement. What do you call tasting? Is tasting just swallowing a small amount of taste, or is tasting putting it in your mouth and spitting it out? So since it's a disagreement, therefore you should have one or two options. One option, I guess three options. You can make a bracha on something else. But the other options are you just decide, I'm not just tasting, I'm actually going to eat the food, and therefore you make a bracha and you swallow, no problem. Or you don't make a bracha, you don't want to eat the food, so spit it out. That's another option. Now, in terms of asur food, right, prohibited food, like it's not kosher, it's stolen, or it's seriously dangerous, you don't make a bracha. Let's say a person forgot to make a bracha. They took a bite of the apple. They have to make a bracha. So if it's solid, you can push it to the side and still make a bracha. Really, the best thing, I suppose, would be to spit it out. Your mouth is clear, you can properly make a bracha. That would be the best. And with liquid, that's probably your only option. Okay, now, in terms of serving someone who won't make a bracha, this is very complicated. There are lots of ways around this, let's say. You don't want to put a michshel, you don't want to put a stumbling block in front of someone. They need to make a bracha, and you're putting food in front of them, they're not going to make a bracha. All right, that's not so good for you to do. And therefore, you can teach them how to make a bracha. You can make a bracha if you're also going to eat it, and they'll say amen. You tell them you're going to have in mind that, this very nice thing. You can maybe have someone else who will make a bracha, and you put the food out for them, and someone else will have, okay. And of course, if there's really going to be caused ill will, like someone's going to be angry about this, okay, so you put out the food, someone brought you a gift or something of food, and okay, you're going to put it out. They're going to be upset if they're going to be insulted or something. That could be okay. Now, in terms of the order of brachas, all right, so this is very intense. So first of all, you have to want to eat. Let's say you have multiple things that you're going to eat. What do you make a bracha on first? What's the order? What goes on here? So first of all, do you actually want to eat both things now? If you actually want to eat both things now, great. If not, then it's easy. You just make the bracha on whatever you want to eat. But if you want to eat both things or multiple things now, what's the order? So there's a few factors. It's the type of bracha, the food itself, and your preference. So in terms of the type of bracha, right, this is the order. You make hamotzi. It's more specific. It's more chashav food, right? That's gonna come first. Then mazonos. Then afterwards agafen. Then bari pri eitz and bari pri adama, right? Vegetable and fruit are kind of similar. And shahakol really goes on anything. And so that's the bottom of the list. So We'll talk about it in a minute. But in terms of the food, right, these are the 7 species that Eretz Yisrael is known for. I've brought down the pasuk here. And the closer it is to the word Eretz, gives it precedence. So just in English, you go wheat, barley, spelt, rye, oats. So pretty much anything that's mazonos, but in this order. And then continuing the order, olives, dates, grapes, figs, then pomegranates. And finally, just in terms of the value of the food, a complete food that's not cut up yet is more chashuv, more important than, let's say, something that's cut up. And in terms of preference, we usually go with, well, I shouldn't say usually, but there's a difference in something that's routinely preferred or just currently preferred. Okay, this is a whole sugya in Gemara, but the very simple idea is, let's say you have 2 different brachas. Usually this will be very straightforward. Why? Because the more specific bracha goes first. So hamotzi obviously come first before anything else, and usually covers anything anyway, except for maybe like fruit or desserts. But let's say a person has cake and coffee, they would make the bracha on cake before they make it on coffee, shahakol, right? Cake, mazonos first. So that's usually what's going to happen, no problem. What happens if it's a fruit and vegetable? This is where things get complicated, of course. So let's say it's routinely preferred one of them, which is usually the fruit anyway, but I guess each person to themselves. They routinely prefer something, that goes first. What happens if they don't routinely prefer one over the other? They like them both equally, or don't like them both equally. So then you go with the 7 species and the order given there. Let's say you have a currently preferred fruit that comes before a routinely preferred vegetable. And of course, a complete fruit would come before, let's say, a cut-up vegetable if you don't have one that's currently preferred and routinely preferred. They're both routinely or both currently, whatever it is. So then the complete comes before the cut-up. And if nothing else, you have a carrot sitting there and an apple, and you love them both equally. So then you're going to do ha'etz before a dama. So this is a lot to remember. A person has to work on it and remember it. And when they're faced with a situation, look this up, right? You get the sheet, try and get the sheet, or try and write this down. Okay, when it's the same bracha, so then you just look at the 7 species. You know, what's the order of the 7 species, though that takes precedence. And then after that, it's whole before cut up once again. And finally, the routinely preferred thing takes precedence. And if really none of these apply, then you just can make a bracha, I suppose, on whatever you want first, or as the main bracha, I suppose. Okay, so what is included when a person makes a bracha? This is also very important. So let's say there's new foods after the bracha, right? That's where things start to get complicated. So let's say you intended to include other foods, great. You intended to exclude other foods. You made a diet, you're eating this apple. I see the orange there, I don't want it. Now that you change your mind, you want to eat the orange afterwards, you have to make a new bracha. You had in mind to exclude it, it's not covered by the bracha. Let's say a person though had no intention, right? This is very important. With no intention, they just made a bracha on an apple, and now they have an orange. Do they make a new bracha or not? So that's going to depend. Was the orange sitting in front of you at the time you made the bracha on the apple? Then great, no new bracha. We'll just assume that was included. Or, for example, let's say it's not an orange, it's an apple. It wasn't in front of you, but it's the exact same food. So good, so the bracha was including that food as well. Now, let's say it's a new food, right? It wasn't in front of you, and it's not the same food. It's a totally new food. Well, if it's, let's say, an apple and orange, they're both solids, or it's 2 liquids like a coffee and a tea, right? So if the first one is still in front of you, when the second one comes, so eat from the second one, you can eat from the second one without making a new bracha, no problem. But if the second food only comes after you're done the first, then you need a new bracha. Okay, now meals. A person has intention to include other foods in the meal, and we'll talk about that, but hopefully later. But the idea would be that, you know, when we're talking about breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a person's really sitting down to really eat a serious meal, right? Let's say with bread or whatever it might be, or solely on fruits, right? These types of things. You have to ask a rabbi, what does it mean, like a meal, not a meal? Maybe we'll get into it, but a person has to know that comes to include other things as well. Now, the less important bracha usually doesn't cover the more important bracha. So, for example, a person has coffee and cake, and they decide by accident they make the wrong thing. They shahakol on the coffee, does not cover the cake. Unless they specifically said, I'm making shahakol on the coffee and the cake, right? They had that in mind. I don't know if you just say it, but you had it in mind. Then it will cover, the shahakol will cover the coffee. It will cover the cake. And you shouldn't do that, by the way. But that would work. A guest has in mind their host's intention, so you didn't, as a guest, know about this other food. Doesn't matter. The host knew. No problem. Now, if food falls on the floor, right, or rather the dirt, you can't eat it, and you just made a bracha. Does that bracha cover other food? Well, it's the exact same food, right? Another apple. okay, no problem. But, it's better if you had in mind all apples, and that way if it fell, okay, so you have the other apple you had in mind. That's a little bit better. Also, better not to drop the food, of course. Okay, but nevertheless, let's say, what do you call stop eating, right? So a person makes a bracha rishon on an apple. When have they stopped eating to the point that now they need a new bracha? Okay, so really it's going to come down to, were they snacking? Was it a meal, or was there an action? Were they a guest? Or rather, was there a group of people? Okay, the details. Let's say a person is having a meal, and now they prepare for Birkas Hamazon by washing mayim achroinim, so Rabbosai Nevarech, right, making that announcement for Zimun, or physically taking the cup of wine. That's enough in a meal that your meal is over. Let's say a person makes a bracha achroina, so right, either they actually bench, of course, or mein shalosh, person just does bracha, the after bracha. So then if it was really by mistake, like 100% they didn't even mean to do that, whoops, I didn't realize, so then they continue eating without a bracha. But when it comes to benching, even if it was a mistake, that's it. Now, let's say someone decides to finish and then leave. What does it count as leaving? We'll talk about. But leaving from room to room, that's normal in the meal, like dining room to kitchen. Maybe that doesn't really count. We'll talk about that. But then a person would really have to make a new bracha if they really decide to finish and they leave. Now, a person goes to daven for a mitzvah, right? You really should not leave. Once you make a bracha in a specific spot, you really shouldn't leave. You shouldn't leave the room even. But person has to do it for a mitzvah. Okay, they don't have to make a bracha when they return. Let's say they sleep. If they intentionally sleep, okay, they're going to need a new bracha. They just nap, though, in their chair. Maybe not a new bracha. Once again, this is going to be a fine line. What's considered hesek hadas? You might need a rav, or you might need to learn more in depth these types of things. Really, all of these things. Okay, let's say there's an interruption for a long period of time, but the person intended to continue eating, so then the person doesn't need a new bracha. Now, let's say the person just decided to stop. They didn't do a physical action. So now, what do you do? Okay, so while they're snacking, right, they're just having a chocolate bar or whatever, a fruit. So then the decision is enough that they're going to need a new bracha. Let's say it's during a meal, like a bread meal, for example, and they haven't done a physical action. So then when it comes to, let's say a person was eating a dessert or drinking something that they needed to make a bracha on, even during a meal. So then that simple decision, now if you want to continue eating those things that weren't covered by the hamotzi, right, you had to make a bracha during the meal on those things. So now you don't have to make a new bracha on those things once again. However, main meal foods, right, that were covered by hamotzi, so now it's going to become somewhat complicated. There are some opinions who really do say that even though it's a meal, you're going to have to make a new bracha. Now, it's a suffix. We're not sure. So you don't make a new bracha. So what's the best option? I suppose the best option is... believe the Achronim, right? That you're just going to end your meal. Just end your meal at that point, be done with it, bench, and I suppose if you really want to eat later on, go for it. Okay, now let's say a guest who decides to stop, so then they don't need to make a new bracha unless they were like certain and firm that no matter what the host does, I'm done. So then they might really, need a new bracha. Now the host can affect the stoppage for the meal even of the guest, unless the guest has in mind, no. I'm continue eating even though the host is done. I'm not done, right? So then, otherwise the guest is going to go after the host, and a wife does not count like the host to her husband. So if she finishes, doesn't mean the husband is done. Okay, now shinu makom. This is very, very important to get right. So hopefully we get it right, of course. But more importantly, hopefully you get to learn in depth a little bit. But how big is a change? What's the type of food? Are you alone or in a group? And now, I mentioned before that, I'm using the, let's say, the Art Scroll Halachos book to organize things, but I'm also using Shari Bracha, so there might be some different parts in here where I can see, at least from my understanding, a little room for disagreement. So a person's really going to have to ask a rabbi or learn it themselves in depth. But just the Rosh Teva is just the simple idea going on here. Right, the headers, the chapter headers. Okay, so let's say the thing doesn't require bracha to return to its place. What does that mean? So a bracha to return to its place that is for sure hamotzi. That for sure you have to, person makes hamotzi, they should return to the original spot to say birchas hamazon. When it comes to, let's say, mazonos like cake or mein shalosh, right? Those, so mazonos, cake, hagafen, wine, or the 7 species from Eretz Yisrael we mentioned before. So those require mein shalosh. It's a disagreement. Do you have to go back to the original spot or not? And same thing with these, just to be clear, I should be clear. That's going to be a disagreement. Specifically, mazonos is a little bit more agreed that you should return to the same place. And the 7 species, there are opinions that you still return to the same place, but maybe not as agreed upon. So you're going to get into a little bit of a fine thing. But anyway, anything that doesn't fall into that category of things you need to return to the place, okay? So therefore, let's say you're leaving your house to another house. So even if you see your original spot, you need a new bracha. Okay? Now, and that's because you've really terminated your eating by leaving. So even if you can see the same spot, it's not good enough if you really left the house. But let's say you're just outside, but you can still see the original place, meaning you didn't go to a new house and you're not really in a public place yet. You don't make a new bracha. Now, let's say it's room to room within the house underneath the same roof. So it's going to depend. Did you have it in mind? Or can you see the original spot? Great. But the Evid, you don't make a new bracha. And really, you should remain where you are in the house. Even if you don't have the above 2 considerations, right? You don't make the new bracha, but you really shouldn't be going from place to place. Maybe there's a little bit of more leeway if it's like super normal for you to do that in a meal, like dining room to kitchen. Now, let's say it's within a room. There's for sure no problem, once again, because even if you can't see that's not called changing your place, right? That's even better than under one roof, of course, being in this exact same room. Right? Open concept, very useful for this. And even if you can't see the original spot, no problem. Let's say you're in an open area, meaning outside, you're taking a picnic. So if it's in Dalet Amos within the 6 to 8 feet of where you made your bracha, no problem. You can move around, no problem. And let's say you go somewhere else in the park, and you can see original spot, that's also okay. But let's say you go over a hill, you can't see original spot, you're going to have to make a new bracha. Now, let's say a yard with a fence, it's actually fenced in, that's like a room to a house. Once again, you really shouldn't leave the house like this, but if a person does, they don't make a new bracha. Okay, now let's say a person eats while walking, right? We're going to start getting into some dicey territory here. What counts here? So let's say they're eating while walking. So if it started this way, then they don't make a new bracha, meaning they were eating while they were walking. They never really made a spot, so they don't make a new bracha at all. You never really made a spot that now you're leaving. Now, if you intended to eat somewhere, even a little bit, and then you decide to leave, so now, and even if you had that in mind, by the way, so let's say you're in a store and you buy, a pizza. No, let's not talk about pizza. Ice cream, right? Shahakol. So you decide you're going to eat some of it in the store, and then you're going to leave. So once you decided to eat some of it in the store, that's enough. That now once you leave, no good. You're going to have to make a new bracha. That's I believe, how Art Scroll decides the halacha. Sharia bracha, I believe, from my memory, is that, that if you had in mind from the very beginning, you really didn't make a place in the store. That you're just eating a little bit and then you're going to go. You didn't make a place. Therefore, you wouldn't need a new bracha when you're going. That's not called shinui makom. So there is a little bit of disagreement. What counts as shinui makom? Right? Did you really make a meal? Did you really have in mind that you're going to continue eating? This starts to get a little bit complicated here. But let's say it's continuous eating. That's a little bit easier. So then there's no shinui makom. Like persons chewing gum, they don't make a new bracha every time. Right? They switch from going inside, outside, whatever it might be. Now it's going to be a little bit more complicated. Let's say you're holding it in your hand, right? So now you moved. Right, you really were eating somewhere else, and now, right, you had a makom before, and now you're moving, but you're holding it in your hand, like the ice cream, for example, or whatever it might be. So now it's going to be a little bit complicated. Now we're getting into a big suffix. Is that called continuous eating or not? Some say yes, some say no. So you wouldn't, in theory, make a new bracha, but there's another way out of that, and that is to actually stop, eating, and to stop walking, and therefore it's not like continuous, and then you keep going and you make a new bracha. No problem there. Okay. Now, let's say you do require a bracha in the place where you, for example, made hamotzi or whatever it might be. So then the meal's not ended, even if you leave. Why? Because you have to return. Even if you don't intend on returning, you're supposed to return. Okay, so now let's say when a person makes a motzi, if they do have intention to leave, then when they're washing and making a motzi, they should have in mind that they're going to a different place. And when they're going to that new place, they should eat a kazayas of bread and bench there, right? If you get a bench there, you should have a kazayas of bread there as well. In terms of mazonos, a person has to also have kazayas before leaving. And once again, this is a little bit complicated. Mazonos, are you really supposed to continue without, this is a little bit problem. So I suppose on both sides, you have a little bit of a suffix here, and therefore you wouldn't make a new bracha, but maybe you're not supposed to leave. So 7 species, for sure you should avoid leaving. With mazonos, it's a little bit more complicated. I believe Mishnah Brura brings down in Shari Bracha that if a person had in mind when they're having the mazonos that they're also going to leave, then that makes it much better that they can continue in that new place without making a new bracha. Now, you get also into a little bit of a complicated situation if you have cake and coffee, right? Why? Because the cake, you're not going to make a new bracha in the new spot, right? If a person was, they have to return to the original spot maybe, so in their new spot, if they continue eating before they return, right? The change of place didn't work. Why? Because they have to return. They're not done yet. So in their new place, when they're eating the cake, no problem. They can continue eating. What about the coffee? The coffee in the first one, right? If it was only coffee, for sure you make a new bracha. But now that you haven't finished your meal because of the cake, well, maybe you haven't finished also the coffee. So this is a big suffix. You just don't continue having the coffee, or I guess avoid the situation if you can. Once again, I guess Safek Brachas L'Hakal, I don't know. You have to ask a rabbi in this situation what you should do. Now, let's say you're eating in a group. Really, any bracha doesn't matter. If you're really eating together in a group, you don't repeat the bracha. Why? Because you're not done your meal. You're not going to leave these people entirely. Now, one of the people still has to remain in the spot and continue eating, right? They have to not be done. Now, of course, the eater has to, when they leave, they have to return back to this place to continue eating with the group without making a new bracha. But if they're just leaving, then they're going to need a new bracha in the new spot. Okay, let's leave it here, and we'll continue with Iker and Tafel. Whole another area in brachas. We're making big progress. We're probably 2/3, maybe 3/4 at the least done. And thank you so much for listening.